But for me personally, what plants and also animals do in the city is kind of, they are emotional counterparts and maybe also a sensual counterpart to everything else that is in the city.
And here it is, the newest episode of the Landscape Architecture series in Urbcast. I wanted to thank you for great feedback that I'm receiving from many of you. And obviously, I will continue with the series. Today, we're gonna have another discussion, this time with Karoline Liedtke-Sørensen, who is the head of landscape at COBE, which is quite known office here, based here in Copenhagen, working with architecture, landscape, and urbanism. Today we will start with Karoline's background and starting her career in landscape architecture and developing her understanding of the landscape architecture. We'll talk about the scale and approach to landscape architecture projects at COBE, balancing the greenery into urban projects, as well as the importance of greenery and social equity in public spaces. We will also discuss working with public and private clients and short and long-term investments in landscape projects. We will conclude by measuring the impact of landscape design, and then a book recommendation will follow. Without further ado, welcome to the newest episode of Urbcast together with Karoline. Let me just start by saying, Karoline, welcome to Urbcast.
Thank you.
I'm very pleased to know that you've heard about Urbcast before.
Yeah, I did.
And I'm also very happy that you agreed to be part of this landscape series that I'm having. Mm-hmm. It's been actually an old idea of mine because it's very inspiring to be working in Copenhagen, especially, and being exposed to all those extremely interesting architecture offices, architects, and landscape architects. And today I would like to discuss many things. I hope we can cover all of them during our conversation. And this episode and this series is especially for young architects, young landscape architects, and the ones that are maybe studying. And they are thinking about how to enter the profession, which is, in my opinion, a very competitive profession. So I would love to get your perspective on landscape architecture. And I think that maybe the best way of starting this discussion would be if you shared your story of how you became landscape architect and also how you ended up in Denmark, because as we already discussed, you from Germany, which is also very good in terms of landscape architecture, I think.
It is, definitely. There's a huge heritage in terms of historical gardens and parks, but also contemporary plannings and parks and so on. Yeah, I think I was born in the former Eastern Germany, close to the border in the Harz Mountains. So I was very much surrounded by forests and nature, very close, just at your front door almost. My father, he's a craftsman, a shoemaker, but also an engineer. And I remember from myself being a child, I was always interested in imagining situations and starting to draw them down. I was drawing already like the small cityscape of our town where I grew up, but also I was drawing sometimes imaginary rooms for my own room where I would put the bed and so on. And then I saw also my father like really imagining things and then just drawing them in bringing them to life in leather as shoes or kind of accessories and so on. And I think this combination of imagining things and then drawing them and seeing them come to life was always interesting to me. But I never thought about actually becoming a landscape architect in the beginning. Was always more thinking in communication design, graphic design, applied for different universities in Germany. And just more like as coincident, then I came into architecture and I thought maybe it's architecture. And then I applied at the university in Dresden actually for architecture. And then I first saw that they even have landscape architecture. I thought, oh, I never heard about that. At this time, you had to go through a test. So you had to apply with a portfolio, and then there was an exam. And And I decided to do that for landscape architecture. And then I got through and passed. And I said, now that I've passed, now I become a landscape architect. And that's how it actually started. Also, I had some friends already living there. And Dresden is a technical university, which is very much based into natural science. I think it's the same concept also in Poland. But also you have the philosophers, the artists. So it's a huge university campus where you have all kind of disciplines gathered together, and you study landscape architecture also together with the architects. So we share a lot of courses, a lot of urban planning, for example, is taught together, landscape architects and architects. And I think there's something that really influenced me, this kind of looking what the architects are doing, and often looking up to the architects, because I always felt they were very secure in how they draw and show things and have always an opinion about things. While we landscape architects, we had so much basis knowledge that we had to gather in this natural science in terms of meteorology, chemistry, earth chemistry, soil chemistry, plants, but botany, and there were so many things. I felt like that we very late in my studies first came to the creative part, while the architects just dived into the concepts. But yeah, and then from Dresden, I started doing my first internship in Berlin and was traveling regularly to Berlin. And Berlin around 2000, 2005 was super interesting. There was so much happening. No money at all, but a lot of interesting offices started pop up, and I started to do my internship at Topotech 1, which worked really creatively and always, they merged this art and landscape architecture and urban planning together. And it was really an amazing time there. And I also got my first job. So I decided immediately after my studies to go back to Berlin and start working there. But in the meantime, I was an exchange student in Copenhagen, Erasmus student, and I was here for a year, and this all also influenced me a lot. Seeing this contrast also between Dresden and Berlin as former Eastern German cities, partly Berlin. And then coming here to Copenhagen, and Copenhagen at this time was not where it is today. It was still not as international. For example, I applied also as SLA for an internship, and they said, we're not working so internationally, and
it's only Germany.
Yeah, and we're not looking for international interns at this time. But it is also 20 years ago, and this changed a lot. I mean, just thinking about SLA. But then after my first jobs in Berlin, I then moved to Hamburg because I got a job offer there at the university, the Hafen City University, and started to go into teaching also, and was an assistant professor there for 4 years. And then from Hamburg, I finally ended up here in Copenhagen 10 years ago. And so I have my 10 years anniversary now here in Copenhagen.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
On your 10 years of being here. That's a journey. Thanks for sharing that. How, during that journey, your understanding of landscape architecture developed? Because when I think of landscape architecture, I think of those two paths. One could be more about the plants and knowing all different trees and species and working a lot with nature, whereas the second one would be maybe this more technical, so making some calculations and using more of the programs, working with some maybe master plans as well. Is any of those paths closer to your heart, or maybe there are some other paths that you could pursue in landscape architecture?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think I would divide it even more as you did, because landscape architecture you can specialize differently in landscape architecture. And already during my studies there, we were asked as students already to specialize in a way by the projects we choose. The landscape architecture that goes very much into the open land and develops concepts for how to develop cultural and natural landscapes. And this is often situated outside of the city. Then there is the landscape architecture that works a lot with urban planning and together also with architects, where it's really about the built environment that you work with. And this you do, of course, creatively, more in the first concept phases, as I'm more interested in. And then, of course, a project continues where you work then more into construction details, being on the construction side and really knowing everything about how to build a landscape. This is really also about infrastructural projects. This is also about plants and planting designs, but it's also very much technical about knowing about the load of, for example, cars and bigger vehicles and how you kind of then build the streets in terms of these loads. And so there's for me like this very technical constructional part. There is the natural part, which is more outside in the environment outside of the city. And then there is the urban landscape architecture, and especially the one that thinks about new concepts for public spaces. And this is the one that I'm really interested, especially the combination of urban planning and landscape architecture at the big scale.
And which one of those are you using mostly while working with projects at COBE?
Here at COBE, I have a little bit of kind of a special role because I'm head of landscape. And this is a kind of a creative lead role where I don't have not responsible for administration and for people, leading people. I'm more interested in more responsible in leading the discipline and push it to a new level, kind of bringing innovation into the office and trying to really find the real and right concept for every project. And for me, it starts in the big scale, in the urban scale. Then it goes down in the further phases of the project into like architecture, and then also, smaller scales. And this is also, I think, what COBE maybe makes very special, that COBE is thinking as an office these scales always together. They always think a city, urban spaces or public spaces, landscape and architecture, and even objects then like one-to-one, a chair, a shoe, a bench, always together. And these, and this is what is interesting about landscape. Then it goes through all these scales. So you start thinking landscape in the urban scale. What are the big spaces? What are the main connections? And what are the atmospheres? And then it goes through the scales. What is the garden? What is maybe the terrace? Which material do we use? Do we also have greenery on the roof? And then it could even become a small planting pot that you design. And I like this way of thinking in all scales, and that nature and landscape is the thing that is going through all of it and connects everything somehow. It's like the glue of everything.
Okay, maybe that's why I had this impression when I was going through some projects of COBE's at your website that they are not very green. And maybe you can defend them. Maybe you can defend it now. But my remark was that some of the projects like Israeli Place here in Copenhagen, or maybe Blixenplex at the University of Copenhagen, or some other projects that you develop. Right now, you also won the Parliament project, and you've created this kind of opening into the ground and some stairs down. But what I missed there, it was greenery. And maybe that's the point to discuss whether the greenery should be part of those projects, or your conception of those urban rooms, of this urban landscape is just different, and greenery is not leading in those.
No, I think what is leading for us is context always. This is where every project at COBE starts, is a context, the social conditions, the natural conditions, the cultural, historical conditions. And all these projects that you name now are very much hybrid projects, where really architecture and landscape architecture merge together, and that are very specific and special in the way they are built. For example, what maybe unites them, especially these projects that you chose now, is that they are not only a park or square, they're often much more. They are often, for example, Israeli Place is a parking garage, an underground parking garage and a square on top. And Blixenplex is parking for bikes and a square on top. And then people often just... for Blixenplex, they often just know these bike domes, but they don't know the green park that actually is connecting Amma also. So it hasn't been published maybe that much. Also, if you name now the competition for the Folketinget, as for the parliament, it's actually COBE's proposal that was the only one with a tree. So, and everybody had the same framework for the competition, that it's actually an under-earth facility. So everybody actually had a hole more or less in the ground, and we just put a tree in the hole to mark the roots of democracy also. So I think there's a lot of projects of COBE that are maybe not so widely published that are actually very green. But just to start, maybe to go back to this idea about the context, Israeli Place, for example, for us was a very urban situation that has to fulfill a lot of needs. There is 2 schools beside the square also that use the square in the break for like playing basketball and football. And so there's a lot of other functions kind of overlaying. And as I said, it's a parking garage. And for us, it was very urban, and it should be very open, very multifunctional, also for markets at the weekends. And that's why it is maybe more urban than a green plaza. While, for example, the Opera Park, it's also, again, a hybrid place, which is partly architecture and a parking garage. And on top, it is a park. But there, we really suggested to have a real park, a real green park, even if it's on a parking lot. And because we thought this is needed here in this part of Copenhagen. And it plays also a nice background or contrast with the opera, actually, which is very big and very solid. And then you have this kind of more romantic park or garden next to it. So, but I wouldn't say that, not at all, that COBE's projects are less green. I think we're also developing a lot of new projects right now. But I have to say that the focus maybe and the awareness of what green can do and how important it is in the city got much, much stronger also within our office within the last 10 years, I have to say. But this is maybe also what is mirrored in our office. When I started, I was the first landscape architect at COBE, and now we are 35 landscape architects. So the importance of this actually, yeah.
That's, I think, a good segue to the next part, and also me addressing the lack of greenery from my perspective in some of these projects is because of the two things. The first is that I think it's my first time having a longer conversation with someone from COBE, so I can ask and talk and share my feelings and also criticize it a bit of what I think is lacking in some of those projects. But the other thing is that's what you said at the end. I wanted to also talk about the role of the greenery in landscape projects. Because the previous conversation I had with Karoline from Shunha, we've been discussing a lot about climate and about sustainability, and also knowing that we have enormous environmental crisis and risks. How can we mitigate those? And I feel like even in urban projects, urban realms, we could do more as industry to steer away from business as usual. So to kind of sum up this broad remark and question I have, what would you say, about designing with greenery? And maybe we should also discuss what can be the greenery.
For me, it is two different things. Also, it can be an infrastructure and has, as you say, a function and can help us solving maybe challenges, which is, of course, very important. But for me personally, what plants and also animals and that can or do in the city is kind of a emotional counterpart and maybe also a sensual counterpart to everything else that is in the city. And this is something that I'm very interested in. It is really the sensual, emotional layer that comes also, even that you're in a very artificial built environment in the city. As soon as you have trees, different plants, animals kind of occupying these trees, you suddenly get a notion and a feeling for the living, for your own perspective and your own, where do I come from? You get a feeling for seasons also. You know, okay, it's spring because you can smell something, you can see something. You know, it's autumn because the leaves are falling down. You can feel the wind and see the wind. And this is extremely important for me as a human being in the city to kind of have connection to that. And this and there's so many emotions involved in that of just, I mean, we all know it's just the first warm day, now it's spring coming out, and then this, when you kind of breathe in and you suddenly smell something different and you feel, there's something coming, and it gets something in you that, and this is so important that you don't lose this contact. And this is for me personally the most important things. And with this, everything else for me comes. With this, there comes, of course, if you want to kind of strengthen this notion, of course, you work with water and you kind of make these processes visible. For example, if it had rained a lot, and of course, we're having challenges with too much rain and so on. But for me, it's more interesting to look at it from this other perspective. If it had rained a lot, it's nice to have a landscape that kind of shows this and makes this visible, that you see, for example, in some kind of topography that is holding the rainwater back, that you see it has rained a lot. And then you see how it also dries and evaporates and that it changes. It's the same also with droughts. Of course, we're having also problems in the city with heat and droughts. And you can read this in the plants and in the landscape. And this is super important for me. And actually, I always start with the emotional and the cultural and in the landscape. And then from there, I start to develop like the needs, the functional needs and the infrastructural needs that these greenery, as you call it, or these parks and can also solve. But I would never start this, then it becomes for me numbers, and then it becomes functionality, and I'm an emotional person, so I would always start there.
You got really emotional. I wish the listeners saw this part of our conversation. You got like really visionary. You started like showing with your hands, gesticulating a lot. And I think there was some emotion there. To follow up on that topic and talk a bit more about the emotions and empathy also in the public spaces, do you think that you, with your projects, also work towards more just landscape? So I mean, trying to make the public spaces with landscape architecture that promote the social equity and ensuring that those spaces are accessible to everyone, to all members of the society, regardless the income.
Yeah, definitely. It's an extremely big topic. And there I always come, on one hand, always also back to nature, because nature is not judgmental. And it's nature is never commercial. And when you, of course, together with the good urban planning and the good architecture, create places that are not commercial, then they start really being equal, because then they are for everybody. They don't, you don't need to pay money to use them. They are truly public. And they give you this way of contemplation that I think is extremely important, and that you can go there and you don't have to do something. Everybody can just sit and enjoy and being influenced by it. And I think this is for me the truly important discussion, because all the other ones, again, are for me technical solutions. If there's a ramp instead of stairs, if there's a certain playground design that is as much supporting young girls as boys, of course, I think this is super important. And also there, I think the whole industry and also the awareness of this has changed completely within the last 15 years, that we have different needs, different genders, different ages that all have to find a place in these public spaces. But the most important thing for me, also coming now from Germany and seeing also maybe sometimes the difference between Germany and Denmark, is really to be aware of creating real public spaces and keeping also very extraordinary spaces. Like we're sitting now here in the North Harbor, and we talked about also the Paper Island before when you arrived here. This kind of gesture, for example, keeping the whole water edge accessible for everybody and open, and not privatizing them, not having like expensive apartments to it. I think these are extremely important decisions to make already in the urban plan, and to keep an accessibility for this. I think it's for me, being equal on a big level. That nature and the big natural bodies, as I often call it, like in Copenhagen, it's the ocean, are always accessible. And they're also accessible in that terms, which is extremely important for me to think about, that they are clean, that they're healthy. For example, for me, was an eye-opener to come to Copenhagen the first time when I was an exchange student, and seeing that they're actually renovating the harbor. And that doesn't mean that they built new bridges, and it meant renovating the water body, really, and the soils within the water from all the contamination and pollution, so that you could actually swim in the harbor again. And you look so far in the future, and when you spend so much money, and this is for me really, quality and equality, because then it means that everybody that maybe cannot pay, like going in a swimming pool, or everybody that maybe not has its own sailboat and can maybe, but still everybody has a possibility to get into the boat and swim, maybe just get a kayak or just a subboard or even just swimming. And I think this is extremely important also to think about when you talk about equality, because the rest is, as I said, is sometimes a bit technical solutions. Yeah, of course, we will have the ramp and so on, as I said. But it's important to think about everybody, definitely. Yeah.
I think it connects also with my next question, because I wanted to talk about the client. So who will finance that? Because obviously we know that projects like this, even though they would address like public needs and would be very equal in terms of access, none of that projects is made for charity purposes, of course. So there always has to be some money. And here I'm just curious, how do you work with clients? Do you mostly, or do you prefer working with, for example, more public clients or more private clients? And how pushing those design solutions and pushing the agenda works while working with those groups?
I think through the history of COBE, as I call it now, I mean, the office is now around 15 years old. It has proven very well for us to work with public clients, also in terms of crises. We have been through many different crises in this time. And the public sector it's a very stable sector, and it's a sector that aims very far out into the future. And this is extremely interesting for us to work with. And it always has the public in its mind. And it has also long-term budget that gives us security in terms of having them as a client. Copenhagen has a very, also compared to Germany, not so much bureaucratic way of working. And I think they have also people sitting in the municipality, in the public sector, that are very educated and often more than in Germany talk the same language and have the same ambitions. And they have also long time experience. I think this is an extreme advantage for the public sector to work with this, while the private investors are often, some, not all of them, but sometimes they're just interested in the short-term money and in the short-term development and in selling things quickly again. But we actually realized also promoting like good public spaces and the good life in the city became more and more interested also for private investors and private clients, because it actually raises the value of their real estate, which is also a bit difficult and can be dangerous in terms of like gentrification and so on. But for example, here, as I said again, in the North Harbor or also on Paper Island, but also in the Bella district that we develop, having good residential estates next to like good public spaces rises really the value of real estate. And the more you have of it surrounding the real estate, the more the prices, the value develops. And this makes then often the investors, it opens their eyes for maybe investing also more into the public around their space.
But could you have any short-term investment with a landscape project? Like when I think of that, a tree might take 30 years to grow. Same with other elements. Is there a way to have a shorter-term profit through more of a public realm project or a landscape project?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just having, for example, a good park next to a residential building, even if the park is not mature or ready yet, people can see what will come and they will imagine also what will come. And definitely. But it's an interesting question because it's something that we're discussing very much in the office right now, especially since we opened the Opera Park. It's also the time horizon of, in general, parks and gardens and nature in general has a different way of working with time than architecture has. And it's actually almost counterparts. Like when you deliver a building, it's done, it's ready, you get the keys, you move in. When you deliver a park, it's not done. It's just started. It was just born. So it even have to grow and it has to develop and get mature. And the more it grows, the more interesting it gets, and the more spatial it gets, the more living it gets, the more valuable it gets also for other insects and in terms of biodiversity.
That's specifically why I wanted to talk about landscape architecture, because I agree. I find it more difficult often, like compared to like delivering a building. Yeah. It's delivered, it's done, and then people move in. But it's such a, to me, more complex process while you work with urban or landscape projects. So I was just curious, how can one approach that? Because Opera Park, I've seen that it was quite green on the images, but they were all renderings.
Yeah, exactly. We try to find a balance right now and discussing it also really in the landscape team, because there's different approaches to it. One approach, which I like really a lot, is again this emotional approach that you are, as a human being, part of this growing and this development of nature, that you don't have a ready-made, for example, of like planting super big trees, and at the opening, for example, the park is mature and green and had cost a lot of money. This approach is more like developing something maybe from smaller bushes, perennials and wildflowers that starts growing, and every time you come back to the park it might look different, and it grows as much as you grow and gets older. But there is of course an urgency right now in the cities of having certain ecological performances or ecological, in Danish you call it økologisk tjenester, that is needed. For example, I've talked about heat, and I also talked about climate change in terms of rainwater and cloud bursts, that we need, for example, mature trees to kind of give shade for certain areas. And then, and if this urgency is so big, then you decide actually to buy a bigger, older tree that costs a lot more money and plant them, and then you almost have a ready-made picture. And this can be really refreshing sometimes. Also in Opera Park, I think it's really amazing to get in, to have a park that at its opening it's there and it's almost done and ready. But it's a bit a different picture that nature normally is, because nature is not ready and it's never finished and it's never done. It's always changing. And I think it's also nice to kind of communicate this through your project. But we're trying to find a balance with this right now and we are not so, at COBE, I would say we are not dogmatic around it. It's, as I said, we always develop projects from their context first. And Opera Parken was a highly exclusive, extraordinary project where also the client, they wanted a ready-made park on a parking deck, which is also a totally official environment. So that's why we decided to go with a ready-made park, big trees, and the park opens, and then you already have this wonderful opera park. While other projects, for example, in Kur, in Karen-Blixensplatz, not the biking hills, but the green hills at the end of the park, we decided to go against like a ready-made rolled grass carpet. We decided to go for wildflowers and establish the seed blending that took kind of some time to establish. Even now, after 5 years, it still looks sometimes wild and messy, which I like. But at the opening, for example, at the park, these grass hills that we did, they were brown because it was just earth and some seeds on it. And the clients was a bit like, And also even here at the office, some of the architects were like, what is this? Didn't we finish the project properly? I said, yeah, it will finish, but not now. It will finish later. And I think it's important sometimes to communicate this also to your clients and also even within the office to your architect colleagues, that things just look different and become different and grow. And
that has to be so tricky to talk to your client and explain that actually the landscape project will be ready, but not like right now, but in a couple of months or sometimes even years.
Yeah, but you mentioned something interesting. It's the art of rendering also, that we always render pictures also here at COBE with mature trees, big trees. And of course you can buy them at a nursery, very expensive, and plant them, but they're very vulnerable also. And maybe we should do images also a bit different. Maybe not only having one image, but maybe always giving the clients 4 or 5 images, saying, okay, this is at the opening, this is 10 years, this is 20 years. And to see that a project, coming back also to investment, that a project is not just now, it's an investment for the future and many years to come, hopefully.
Especially in Denmark, when like half of the year is just shitty and gray and rainy, and the second half is obviously beautiful. So I think it's fair to show like those two visualizations next to each other. So this is how your park will look in a rainy November day, and that's how the park will look in a sunny June
Well, then
afternoon.
You can come back to the whole emotional discussion again, because I think there's absolute beauty also in these gray things. And you can use it creatively again. As I said, like making the water visible and maybe making planning also public spaces for winter especially, or using plants that are maybe evergreen and could also are also green on winter. And finding... I think these challenges can be used super creatively and are an inspiration also.
I think I would like to also discuss measuring the impact of landscape design. This is something I think you've already mentioned, that you maybe do not document those that much, but still I think it's very relevant to discuss. So once we test and work with performance of a building on many different levels, how would you measure the effect of landscape architecture of a successful project? Do you have any measures you use?
There's many different measures to use, because as much as there are different layers in landscape architecture. So there's of course the let's say the dead material in the landscape, which is all the pavings and the gravel and all this, where you, of course, through different life cycle analysis, as you do in architecture, you measure like These numbers about which impacts does these materials have? Can we recycle them? Can we reuse them? How are they actually built in, for example, in the paving or in furniture? Can we kind of separate them again, reuse them? Where are they coming from, and so on? This is very much. I mean, landscape. You also have to be aware it's almost as much as built as architecture very often. That's why it's also called landscape architecture, because it's really, for me, the built environment. But then there's, of course, also all the living sphere in these projects, which are the plants and the animals, the insects, and that. And there's different methods of measuring that. Of course, there's a lot of innovation happening right now, also with artificial intelligence, that is through sensors and cameras and measuring really the quantity, for example, of insects. So there's different companies that we work together with that put their cameras in the new parks, and then they measure the amount of insects, and the artificial intelligence, they can see different insects by different wings and different frequency of the wings. So it can say, okay, this special insect here is coming in this amounts, this is coming in this amounts, and then you get really one-to-one data, which is super interesting also, I think. And of course, you can also measure temperature and all that. So there's different ways of measuring it. And it's super interesting and also very important for our clients very often to have these data at the end. And it's a new way also of us finding new collaborations and building up new networks also with different new companies that are, as I said, working in different fields of technology, and but also working with biologists that are coming out after 2 years, after 5 years, after 10 years to the project, also measuring different, seeing different species coming back. Or there's different ways of doing it. But again, for me, this is very much part of this whole technical solution that I'm personally not so interested in. I think for me, measuring is also maybe happiness, and but maybe it is happiness and also everyday life. I think if you, for example, Copenhagen is a very successful example for high quality of life and for a very happy everyday life that you can live here. And I think that Copenhagen is successful in terms of bicycle politics, for example, and which is also public space, all the bike lanes and how you park your bike, how you get from A to B with your bike, having a secure bike network and so on, for example, which makes your everyday life much more easy. You could also measure this by asking people, for example, making questionnaires about how happy are you in your everyday life, bringing your kid to school, how secure do you feel? Because now we talked equality, also public space is often also very much about security and how safe you feel and safety, how safe you feel like when you're in this park or anything. And I think this is also something which is measured actually. And we have to also look into this aspects.
To make a full circle and finish where we started, I would like to ask you for some inspiration to the youngest, to the students of architecture, of landscape architecture, and adepts of landscape architecture. How could they prepare themselves in the best possible way, in your opinion, to enter this very competitive market, as we already discussed, a market that has many different challenges? Yeah, I think that this advice would be great. I would love to have some advice when I was starting my own kind of career and studies. So I'm using this podcast also as a platform to those who would like to be inspired.
Yeah, there's so many ways of. I think for me, actually, it was very important to know where I come from and what really drives me, to get a feeling for this. And I think there are different niches within landscape architecture for everybody. But being aware of what you're really interested in, really drives you, is something that helps you actually finding your path. Are you more interested in really the creative phases, in building up a narrative around landscape, or as I said, me being maybe more interested in the emotional aspect of nature? Or are you more like a technical person? Finding out this and finding the right niches is kind of important, and it's super important to be curious and to be open and to really meet the world open and take everything in, travel, see different things. but also try to make connections. I think landscape is always interconnected, and it's try to make these connections and be aware of these connections. For example, also how is, for example, certain aesthetics and design also connected to politics, to our history, to our cultural heritage. Where are we going into the future? What is happening in politics, for example? And this is very important. And also listen to your gut feeling. Coming back to this emotional, I think there's always something inside of you, some kind of intuition and emotional thing that is as much as important as also knowing your stuff. I think having, for example, for me, having this kind of very this education from this technical university and having like a possibilities to also learning chemistry, to also do this. I was so annoyed when I was a student, but now I'm actually very, very thankful for this, because knowing the natural science basics gives me a lot of inspiration for a lot of things. Knowing the plants, knowing a little bit about materials, and really knowing your stuff is kind of important, and no matter where you go, if you go into more like construction technical phases or going in the creative phases, it's a super nice archive. You can always find something, and this also helps you again to make these connections. And yeah,
I also learned from you about this new division for landscape architecture, this more conceptual and this more technical, when you basically do more of the detail and drawings. That's something that makes sense, definitely, to divide it like this as well. Also, to maybe inspire the listeners even more, I was wondering if you could recommend any book, maybe attached to the topic, not necessarily, but if you have a good read to recommend to the listeners, it would be great.
Yeah. Now that we talked about also being open and curious and making connections, I have a very book of my heart, which is not related to landscape architecture.
Okay.
And it's not a guidebook through new projects or anything, but it's by a philosopher and a writer called David White. He's originally from Ireland, but he was traveling a lot. He was even a guide on the Galapagos Island and studied also biology. And he has a book which is called Consolations. Now I have to find it. It's a longer title. It's called Consolations, the Solace, Nourishment, and Underlying Meaning of Everyday Words. And I mean, you're doing a podcast here, and what we do is we talk and we communicate. And I think it's so important to know what words really mean and be really precise around the words that you know. And there's words that he describes, for example, in his book. It's super nice. It started with A, alone, and it stops with W, work. And then you have words like anger, friendship, loneliness, despair. There's a lot of words from A to W that he describes in small chapters. What do these words really mean, like from a philosophical view, but also from starting maybe thinking new about these words. And I think this is extremely inspiring to think sometimes. Also, when we talk landscape architecture, we often talk about green and greenery and so on. And this is just very superficial sometimes. And I sometimes wish that, for example, landscape architecture, and we talk a bit more precisely about things and also what we mean with this and what they can mean for others and how they can help us. And I think he's very much an inspiration of words and being a master of words, and it helps sometimes to look a little bit besides your profession and your discipline to find inspiration.
But I think it's a good approach, actually. My previous guest, Jakob from Shunha, he said that he learns most through reading something that is completely outside of landscape architecture and tries to apply those to his own profession. And I think that's also very, very important to know what's happening outside. And also there is no guidebook on how to become a successful landscape architect, I guess. You didn't recommend this one, but you shared a lot of interesting perspectives and inspirations for the listeners. So I hope they will find it very useful. And I wanted to thank you for being here, for joining the landscape series. And I need to say I really enjoyed our conversation. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. I also did. And thank you for this very nice questions. It's, as I said before, it's good sometimes to take an hour to just reflect and maybe communicate with somebody that comes with questions that you always think, of course, of course we have to do it like this, and why are you asking? But I think it's very helpful also for me.
that was the episode of the Landscape Architecture series in Urbcast. Thank you very much to listening to my discussion with Karoline, here head of landscape at COBE. If you would like to get to know something more about her work, you can also look into the episode description. I will add the links about the series, about Karoline, and also about the book recommendation. Stay tuned for the next episode in the series and of the podcast. Talk to you soon.